Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sandro Galea, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome. Before we begin, a word of thanks. First of all, thank you to all of you for joining us today on the first day of summer and the longest day of the year. And a thank you to Alicia Noel and Meredith Brown, who made today happen. Thank you. We just finished an academic year like no other. During this time, these public health conversations have served as a chance to discuss key issues of concern to health. They continue to provide space to come together as a community to learn from speakers about issues of consequence for health. Now, to my mind, if this past year has taught us anything, it's the core importance of education, how education is central to the mission of public health. The COVID moment called for the generation of new knowledge and the flexibility to apply this knowledge to changing circumstances. This speaks to the central goal of education, to advance knowledge towards the creation of a better world. In academic public health, we have worked to meet this moment, even as we continue to learn so we can do ever better. Today's event aims to help inform that progress. This is the third event in our Teaching Public Health series. At these events, we have welcomed speakers to discuss how public health pedagogy can evolve and adapt to support the next generation. Today, we will discuss transformative educational models for a future system of education for public health. Our speakers will guide us in a conversation about shaping educational models that are valued, relevant, accountable, adaptable, and impactful. I very much look forward to learning from our outstanding guests. Thank you to everybody here for joining this conversation and for helping it continue towards creating a better world. It's now my great privilege to turn the screen over to the intellectual architect of this conversation, our Associate Dean of Education, Dean Lisa Sullivan, who will introduce our speakers and moderate the event. Dean Sullivan, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Galea. As Dean Galea said, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed lots of challenges, one of which is the importance of teaching in academic public health. And as we've all tried to learn from what's happened over the past 18 months, we hope that we will learn new things and make long overdue changes. And this symposium is a step in that direction. We have 6 great speakers for you today, and I'll introduce each one before they speak. Again, please use the Q&A for any questions. We have time set aside at the end for all questions. If you'd like to address a question to a specific speaker, please do so, and I will try to ask them at the end. So our first speaker is Dr. Kimberly Jacob Areola. She is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Behavioral, Social, and Health Education Sciences in the Rollins School of Public Health of Emory University. For the past 20 years, her work has focused on improving the health of marginalized populations and communities of color. She serves as Executive Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for the Rollins School. In this role, she serves to steward the academic mission of the school. She's a tireless and inspirational leader, and soon she will be taking over as Dean of Emory's Laney Graduate School. Today, she'll be presenting What If? Toward a model of inclusive excellence in public health teaching. Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sullivan. Give me just a moment. Okay. It is an absolute pleasure to be a part of today's panel. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate. So as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a model of inclusive excellence in public health teaching. Let me start with a definition, because inclusive excellence is a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Inclusive excellence lies at the intersection of diversity and quality. It is considered to have these 4 primary elements. 1, a focus on student intellectual and social development. Now, academically, it means offering the best possible course of study for the context in which public health education is offered. 2, a purposeful development and utilization of organizational resources to enhance student learning. Now, organizationally, it means establishing an environment that challenges each student to achieve academically at high levels and each member of the campus to contribute to learning and knowledge development. Number 3, attention to the cultural differences learners bring to the educational experience and that enhance the enterprise. Now, when I say cultural differences, I'm talking about race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, first language, physical and learning ability, learning style, and a range of other characteristics. And 4th and finally, it refers to a welcoming community that engages all of its diversity in the service of student and organizational learning. Now, public health represents an alarming paradox. On the one hand, our field exists for the purpose of promoting and protecting the health of people and the communities where they live, learn, work, and play, locally and globally, with particular emphasis on improving the health of those who are most vulnerable. But at the same time, academic public health has a dirty little secret, which is that students who represent the cultural differences I just described experience inequities that hinder progress towards their public health socialization and career success. Careers that for many serve to combat the very health inequities that we insist need to be eliminated. Now, this paradox becomes very personal when faculty who teach in public health have a hard time conceiving of the idea that their classrooms are anything less than fully inclusive, because they, in fact, are committed to the ideals of social justice espoused by our field. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. directly spoke to the ways in which well-meaning people can hinder social progress. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." So what if, instead of assuming a position of defensiveness, as public health faculty and administrators, we acknowledged our biases and stereotypes and the ways in which they undermine our efforts to pursue inclusive excellence? We could be humble, acknowledge that we struggle with inclusive excellence because we live in a society that also struggles with it, and commit to learning and growing from our mistakes, which has come to be known as failing better. So if we can start with the understanding that there is much work to do in our field, then it invites a conversation of our role in undermining or promoting inclusive excellence and the broader sociopolitical context that shapes it. Now, drawing from a socioecological framework allows us to more deeply appreciate the broader forces that bear down on the classroom environment. Now, this is important because much of the thinking around inclusive excellence has focused on these lower levels, like the faculty, the syllabi, the characteristics of the classroom environment. Now, this demonstrates how we have a habit of focusing on the more proximal determinants of a behavior in public health without considering the upstream determinants. So what I'm going to do today is walk through just a few of the levels of influence with an imagination of what inclusive excellence looks like at that level. So what if local, state, national, and international sociopolitical contexts supported inclusive excellence? There would be local, state, and national laws that affirm the full humanity of all people, regardless of their social identities. There would be a clear acknowledgement of the ways in which historical injustices towards Black, Indigenous, and other people of color created stark health disparities that perhaps no longer even exist. We would not find it culturally acceptable to blame individual behaviors, attitudes, and moral failure for poor health, while constraining the resources needed to create environments that promote health. And importantly, we would use this type of orientation to frame public health education. What if the norms and practices in the field of public health supported inclusive excellence? Our accreditation criteria would require schools and programs of public health to create a student-centered learning environment that facilitates the production of learning. These criteria would set a high bar for schools and programs of public health to honor a classroom of learners who are different in terms of social identity. Our professional organization would implement training and program development to support administrators' ability to create inclusive environments. Now, this might include collecting and disseminating resources that can be used by schools and programs to implement promising practices within their institutions. Now, these same professional organizations would provide assessment tools to identify areas in which improvement is needed, then importantly, hold schools and programs accountable for making progress in these areas. What if school and university administrators supported inclusive excellence? Well, we would commit substantial resources to educational diversity, equity, and inclusion. We would assess and adapt our curricula and performance metrics to emphasize inclusivity and health equity. Our institutions would promote norms and expectations that faculty, staff, and students are as diverse as the communities that they study and serve. We would create promotion and tenure guidelines that require evidence of inclusive teaching from the perspective of students, peers, and perhaps even community members. What if department chairs supported inclusive excellence? Well, they would provide templates for syllabi to ensure that a tone of inclusive excellence is established at the outset and assess their faculty's effectiveness by monitoring course evaluation data and other sources of data. They would hold faculty and student-facing staff accountable through annual evaluations and department-specific promotion and tenure criteria. They would lead the development of curricula that ensure that students are trained in community-engaged research out of a deep acknowledgement of the need to give voice to those we study. The concentration-specific curriculum would ensure that students are trained to disseminate their research findings to lay audiences and use to guide public health practice. What if faculty supported inclusive excellence? Well, we would adopt general strategies that acknowledge the biases and stereotypes we bring to the table, treat students as individuals, not as representing a group. And we would monitor the climate of the classroom to ensure that there is not a centering of some student voices over others. We would ensure inclusivity of topics, voices, readings, experiences, and expertise when designing our syllabi and conducting our classes. We would moderate class discussions in a way that encourages all students to participate, balancing openness and safety, emphasizing the importance of different perspectives, and we would intervene when offensive remarks are made by students. What if students supported inclusive excellence? Students would denounce the social hierarchies that are designed to create division. They would help create brave spaces in which difficult conversations can occur in a sensitive and affirming manner. They would bring humility, vulnerability, and openness in the same ways we expect this of all faculty, staff, and administrators. They would be genuine allies across different social identities. We will know that inclusive excellence has really become embedded in our culture when the term becomes obsolete. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Arreola. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Jonathan Garcia. Dr. Garcia is Assistant Professor and Program Director of Global Health in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences at Oregon State University. His work focuses on health disparities at the intersection of sexuality, gender, and race. He uses innovative teaching methods to advance student success through the lens of equity, inclusion, and diversity. Today, he will speak on bidirectional and experiential learning as critical to teaching global public health. Jonathan.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to Dean Galea and Dr. Sullivan for inviting me to be on this wonderful panel. Today, I will discuss bidirectional learning as a way to transform the central challenges in global health education. This will be done through a few objectives. First, I will define key terms, including global health and bidirectional learning. And I will describe how the three challenges in global health education are overcome through bidirectional learning, namely through cultural humility, mutual identification, self-reflection, and co-creation, and offer some of these solutions to these challenges. I provide an example in a peer education program to illustrate how these techniques can be applied in global health teaching. And so to offer the definitions before moving forward, when I refer to global health, I am describing the study of how transnational processes, such as social and economic polarization, lead to marginalization and health disparities. Global health involves an exchange of ideas, cultures, peoples, and solutions. When guided by a human rights framework, global health builds on equitable partnerships with and for communities. And here I focus on a global learning model that encourages participants to challenge banking models of education that unidirectionally determine what is right and wrong, what is true and false. Author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire, advocates for bidirectional learning, a pedagogy in which students co-create new knowledge that directly relates to their lives and is rooted in the hope of changing social conditions. So the first challenge that I want to discuss is trying to acquire cultural humility. And so when I talk to first-year global health students, one of the main driving forces that they describe is trying to help others in poor countries, which is in itself a worthy goal. This goal becomes problematic, however, when it assumes that the United States has all of the answers to the problems for the rest of the world. And when we ignore health disparities and the marginalization that occurs within the United States, and we see ourselves as different or better than. And in turn, we don't look to the globe for solutions to problems in the United States. This creates a false dichotomy of savior and saved, of helper and helped, that deepens unequal power dynamics and perpetuates systems of oppression. This idea of cultural humility is necessary to transform these dichotomies and power imbalances and promote global learning. In a concept analysis conducted by Ferranda et al. In 2016, the attributes of cultural humility included openness, awareness, supportive interactions, and self-reflection and critique. They also identified some of the consequences of cultural humility, which included mutual empowerment, partnerships, respect, and lifelong learning. Which brings me to my second challenge, connecting with diverse populations. Global health studies involve a deep immersion in diverse cultures. The curiosity that drives students to learn about different cultures can also lead them to seeing those cultures as exotic or abnormal. For example, the distinction between the first world and the third world countries creates a false dichotomy and can be used to stereotype those living in so-called third world countries as less developed, backwards, unmodern, uneducated, or primitive. Consider instead the notion of the fourth world, introduced by sociologist Manuel Castells, to describe the pockets of extreme social and economic marginalization that exist in all countries, from the South Bronx to Soweto. Notions like the fourth world are effective at recognizing that all countries contain pockets of social exclusion generated by social and economic polarization that generate health disparities and differential access to basic needs. On a societal level, mutual identification and self-reflection allows us to transform our stereotype of faraway lands and to see the global processes and systems of oppressions that cut across settings as the root of shared problems. On an individual level, mutual identification taps into our personal experiences with marginalization and privilege, and students can begin to reflect on what colors their perspective of others. In this way, stereotyping, othering, tokenization, and exotization can be transformed through self-reflection and mutual identification into empathy and solidarity. My third challenge is this idea of co-creating solutions by and for the community. When knowledge is exchanged unidirectionally, the student does not have a chance to subjectively interact and to assimilate the information. Through the co-creation of knowledge, however, students are asked to bring their own lived experiences and to co-construct knowledge about the topic. Co-creation of global health knowledge grounded in community engagement can effectively generate ownership to solutions that are sustainable. So these are three challenges that highlight core aspects of global health as a discipline that advances social justice. Next, I'll provide an illustrative example. The Engaging the Next Latinx Allies for Change and Equity program, or ENLACE, is a critical consciousness raising program, a peer education program to train Latinx students as allies for their LGBTQ peers. ENLACE was inspired by the work of the Brazilian Interdisciplinary AIDS Association in Rio de Janeiro and uses popular pedagogy to develop skills to confront social isolation, stigma, discrimination, and to promote pride in sexual and gender diversity. By drawing on the lessons from the world to address social isolation in the United States, ENLACE involved transformative global learning based in cultural humility. And ENLACE was part of the 4-H Outreach Leadership Institute, which is a pipeline program at OSU that prepares underserved high school students for college readiness and outreach leadership. It involved college and doctoral students in hands-on community engaged work, making the films that I'll talk more about with Outside the Frame, an NGO in Portland, Oregon, and conducting workshops as well as evaluating them. So in ENLACE, we made telenovelas, or Spanish soap operas, which are central to the Latin American cultural imaginary. These have been used to discuss contemporary social issues like bullying, family rejection, homelessness, HIV infection, and substance use. So we had 45 Latinx LGBTQ youth, 4-H youth, Latinx parents, and health providers collaborate together to make the themes of the telenovela. And then a group of Latinx LGBTQ youth co-created 5 films based on their lived experience. And these made the backbone of the peer education program. So this is a picture of November 2019, where we had our premiere of the films in Portland, Oregon, before an audience of 400 people. And the films are currently, during the pandemic, the films were used as part of a peer education online workshop to train high school Latinx students as LGBTQ allies using the telenovela videos. And they trained in empathetic listening and solidarity, mental health consequences of discrimination and systems of oppression, addressing bullying, navigating resources, and pledging allyship and solidarity. Through this process, they shifted their understanding of social isolation from an individual characteristic that was based in individual failings, which was their initial conception, to one that was understanding social isolation as a systems problem. And so the last activity of the workshop involved making posters that they would potentially show at a peaceful demonstration. And these are 2 of the posters that the youth made to show their allyship. Last, I'll describe some implications. So bidirectional global learning can be transformative. In this example, the students in the United States learned from Latin American solutions to social isolation and were able to connect with deep emotional levels, tapped into their experience to connect with each other and with the material being taught. Experiential learning based in empathy, solidarity, and co-creation can be effective in training the future of public health through pipeline programs such as in LACE. These programs can be held online, like we have done, employing interactive techniques such as role-playing, emotional thinking, and using creative media like telenovelas. So I am happy to present in LACE and willing to listen to the other presentations. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. Now we'll turn to Dr. Brenda Kirkwood. Dr. Kirkwood currently serves as Director of Online Education at the University of Albany School of Public Health, where she is also a Clinical Associate Professor in the Department of Health Policy, Management, and Behavior. Dr. Kirkwood has experience in higher education, spanning public and private institutions on the associate, baccalaureate, and graduate levels. Today, she will be presenting on shifting traditions to serve non-traditional students. Brenda.
Great, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion today. So my comments will be focused on serving students as part of these transformational educational models, which are on the horizon. So although higher education isn't well known for being very nimble, in order to best serve students, we need to adapt our traditional way of doing things, particularly because our student body is changing. And it extends far beyond the traditional student who may step directly into college from high school, or the student who moves directly from their bachelor's degree to graduate school, as we see more non-traditional students matriculating in programs. So considering the field of public health is so broad, it has consistently attracted students from a range of backgrounds with varied interests. However, we are seeing a shift to an older, more experienced student body who isn't necessarily pursuing an MPH for the credential or to help them land their first job, but rather their motivations may include career advancement within their current employment, or to assist them in performing their current job better with a better understanding of population health, honing their knowledge and skills. Perhaps they are seeking a career change, or maybe they are just interested in learning more about the field or a particular content area within the field. I'm currently advising students that range in age from 21 to 74 years of age old. So that is incredibly exciting and it's very fulfilling, yet it does highlight the different needs among students as they are at various stages of their careers. A one-size-fits-all approach just really isn't very valuable. And at my institution, the average age of our online MPH student body is 10 years older than our on-campus MPH student body. The on-campus MPH student body tends to be comprised more of what we would consider a traditional student. So with these adult learners, but we're also seeing this among the younger student population too, students are balancing a lot. In addition to full-time or part-time employment, they are tending to families and other personal obligations, all while pursuing their degrees. I know I'm constantly in awe of how much our students take on and are able to balance. So I view that there are actions that colleges and universities can and should take to make it more attractive and more feasible for students to pursue their studies and to be successful in doing so. Flexibility is key. So as students juggle multiple professional and personal responsibilities, they may be able to only take 1 or 2 courses at a time, and that's okay. But many existing academic programs and student services were developed with a full-time student in mind. So when mapping out course sequencing and scheduling, consider the part-time student. For example, if they miss their chance to enroll in a prerequisite, you don't want them to have to wait an entire year to resume coursework. I'll also take this opportunity to just put in a little plug for scholarships for part-time students. The eligibility criteria for so many scholarships require full-time status, but part-time students can also certainly benefit from scholarship funding. Just because they may be working, they too have expenses to cover. So that's just a general consideration for all funding opportunities, to also be mindful of the part-time student. Having stackable programs is also quite beneficial, and for a number of reasons. If a student has been out of school for a while and they're uncertain whether they really want to go back, they may be more inclined to start with just a course or a set of courses, such as with a certificate, and then it makes attainment of a full degree from that point more within their reach. There's also another logistical reason for having programs that can stack. When a student is pursuing a program on a part-time basis, it can take quite a while for them to complete their program. So by offering them a certificate or badge or some recognition of successful completion of a set of coursework along the way, it benefits the student, since they can add that to their resume and demonstrate to an employer that they have attained mastery of content in the interim while they continue on their academic journey, rather than having to wait until they complete the entire degree. Another way that higher ed can incorporate flexibility is to allow students to begin the program at various points throughout the year. So rather than focusing on a fall semester start, which so many programs do, provide more opportunities to begin the program. We find that once a student makes up their mind to pursue the program, they are ready right there and then. So we don't want to lose that desire, but to seize it at the time. Also, life happens, and it's common for our working professionals to take time off to tend to other obligations. So we should be making this as easy as possible for students to stop and then restart coursework. This past year and a half also has certainly showed us what we are capable of when we use innovation and technology. Online courses have been and will continue to be, I believe, desirable among the adult learner population. Again, in my opinion, you just can't beat the flexibility provided by online education, but also be thinking about how students are accessing their course content. Students are already completing entire degrees through their mobile phones and other devices, and I envision that this will grow as technology evolves. So keeping up with technology is going to be important as well. And along those lines, during the pandemic, most student services shifted from on-campus to virtual, everything from student financial services to the writing center to career services and counseling services. So building on that experience can certainly be beneficial to students by continuing to provide those virtual services to serve all students. I added here on the slide a suggestion to broaden professional development services, because career service needs for a student who transitioned straight into college from high school, they're going to be different compared to someone who has worked for 30 years already. So those types of services should evolve along with the evolution of the student body composition. Also, faculty who are accustomed to teaching the traditional student may require some extra guidance or training on ways to incorporate flexible accommodations for students while maintaining fairness and high expectations that we seek among our students. So this is an area worthy of attention moving forward. Students have a lot to offer. In particular, when the student body is comprised of individuals with varied and extensive work and life experience, the line is blurred between teacher and learner. So acknowledging that breadth and depth of student expertise can really go a long way in establishing rapport and productive connections that can last well beyond graduation. It's a win-win situation. Public health is a very practical, hands-on field. So when you have students already working, that provides rich opportunities for them to immediately apply course concepts and vice versa for their experience to inform even course content and course activities. So I envision the future will hold more of a merging between academic coursework and professional practical work. So just to wrap up my comments pertaining to student services of the future, we always want to learn from the past. We need to serve our current students in the present, but we need to prepare for the future student and what their specific needs are. It's important to truly understand our audience to ensure programs and courses are structured in a way that fits their schedules and their specific needs. It's doable, but it will require a shift from the way things were always done to building in that all-important flexibility. It's going to be interesting to see really where it goes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirkwood. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Leah Neubauer. She's Assistant Professor of Preventive Medicine in the Division of Public Health Practice in the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. Her primary area of scholarship is focused on curriculum development in the health-related professions and sciences. As an educational methodologist, she conducts collaborative global research specifically focused on school-based sexual and reproductive health programs. She will be presenting on Towards Dramatic and Fundamental Change, Is Academic Public Health Ready for Transformative Learning? Leah.
All right. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Galea for the invitation as well. So I'm Dr. Leah Neubauer from Northwestern University. I want to start with a land acknowledgement of my own university on the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. As a member of the Northwestern community, I honor and acknowledge this history and recognize the dedication and importance of Indigenous culture to the lands and communities with whom we live, learn, and work. I'll also acknowledge this presentation was certainly prepared in my own capacity. Finally, for introduction, I'd like to extend thanks again to BU, School of Public Health, to my Northwestern colleagues, and quite aligned with a talk on transformative education and learning, I want to just acknowledge my own system of educational supports, and quite specifically, the first teachers of transformative education and learning, my own mother and my grandmother. So my comments are charged with doing two things. One, I want to situate transformative education in adult education and transformative learning literature. And second, I want to invite you all to consider what makes for transformative education and what is our and your charge in academic public health education and training. So I'm a critical adult educator here in academic public health. My broad questions focus on how adults learn across the lifespan. My practice examines the design, implementation, and evaluation of curriculum. And critical adult ed, like academic public health, is also concerned with transformation at multiple levels. We're also concerned with the social function of universities, what Brookfield and then Harper and I talked about this past year, considering the social function of a university and the extent to which the field and its workers leave unchallenged dominant cultural values and social systems in which these practices produce existing patterns of inequity. So from the social function of the university, I invite you into a definition of critical adult education. Now, the 3 bullet points are organized around 3 core tenets of critical adult ed, and the italicized text you see underneath would be my questions for you to consider. The first is that adult education is more than the design and management of effective learning. So how do we know if our curricula is and are effective? Moreover, what are the big aims of our curriculum? In the middle, critical adult ed considers activities as more than the adult learner's sense of control in their own life, in their own interpersonal relationships, but also the relationship of the adult education student to social forms and structures. The question for us to consider is, how do curriculum build competencies, enhance skills, and also prepare our students to interact with and challenge social forms and structures? Last, on the sense of control, it's not only intrapersonal, it's also one sphere of socio-political behavior and intellectual exploration, judgment, and discrimination. The question for us to consider is what do we prepare our students to do, and what are the bounds of this? So on to transformative education. I invite you to consider right now here on this webinar, what is the purpose for you, for your school or program, for the profession, and for society? From this consideration, I'll offer 3 perspectives of transformative learning. The first is Jacques Mezirow, what was dubbed in 1978 as perspective transformation, a study that you see here from Adult Education Quarterly, a study that followed women returning to community college after an extended hiatus. Upon their return, enrollment in the education program and critical awareness of their context and the examination of the assumptions surrounding their lives as women in the late 70s, they emerged differently. They talked about a disorienting dilemma, who they were when they entered community college and who they were when they left were 2 different people. From Jacques Mezirow, I invite Paulo Freire, as discussed already by my colleague, Dr. Garcia, a conscientization that the critical awareness of one's social reality and collective transformation happens with action and critical reflection, that one's critical reflection includes fundamental core action. From Freire, I'll close with my 3rd example of transformative learning in the fairly recent writings of Stephen Brookfield, that transformation is a process in which the foundational elements of something are forever radically changed. It's not the same as getting better, becoming empathetic or democratic, or improving as an activist or teacher. Transformation is far more dramatic than that. Brookfield implores evacuating meaning. He invites consideration that we've been overusing the term transformative learning. He writes further, a transformation of learning means that the tectonic clusters of one's paradigmatic assumptions and most enduring and dependable perspectives one has used to make sense of the world are forever fundamentally altered. I've shared 3 examples of transformative learning and a foundational definition of critical adult education. I invite you to consider, where is transformative education or learning in academic public health education? In your practice, in your unit, or in your university? Why do you believe it's transformative? Could it be the absence or presence of the disorienting dilemma, fundamental social action, or as Brookfield invites us, is it the dramatic, fundamental, and irreversible changes that lie ahead in academic public health? And it's with his definition that what is transformative learning is dramatic, fundamental, and irreversible that I invite you to consider what this means in your own world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neubauer. That was great. Next, we will hear from Dr. Laura Liang, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Assistant Professor in the Department of Health Behavior, Society, and Policy at the Rutgers School of Public Health. As Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, she plays an essential role in the school's accreditation process, seeks to expand the school's portfolio of programs, and oversees the evaluation and assessment of the school's academic programs. Her work is in planning, organizing, implementing, and evaluating health education programs across the educational continuum. And she will speak on lessons learned and promising practices for the future of public health learning education. Laura.
Thank you, Dean Galea and Dr. Sullivan. I do appreciate this opportunity to talk about what you just mentioned, what I feel like are a few lessons that we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, and some promising practices that have emerged for the future of public health education. So as Dr. Sullivan noted, I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Rutgers School of Public Health in New Jersey, and I'm really pleased to be here today. And since I'll be talking about how we've become more aware of the human side of education, I wanted to share a little bit about me. So here are a few photos that highlight what I do in my personal time. We all know that the pandemic is the largest disruption to education in human history, with 1.6 billion students across the globe that were impacted at a time. We had to rethink the traditional educational practices as we knew them, and we had to bravely walk into a strange, unknown world. But today, I think it feels like we've been in a long tunnel and we're finally starting to reemerge and seeing a new day. And as we step into this new day, we want to reflect on what we have learned through our experience, as well as reflect on what new strategies should stay as we move beyond the pandemic. And I wanted to share 3 major lessons that I think we have learned, but you may also think of many others as well. So first lesson is I think that the pandemic really proved education could be nimble, could be agile, and we can make decisions quickly, even with ambiguous data. To use a common expression, we learned that education can turn on a dime. Like educators across the world, we went online practically overnight. But now we need to reemerge knowing we can be much better than before. And to do that, we need to continue evolving, and we need to be willing to take risks and encourage out-of-the-box thinking. As a result of knowing we can quickly adapt, we should continue innovating to produce public health leaders and practitioners that can adapt to today's and tomorrow's challenges, knowing that there could be other things that come up. Technology is more important than ever. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a bias towards using technology to enhance learning, but today we are using technology for everything in higher education, from admissions to retention, to student wellness, and of course, for student learning and engagement. Technology can even be used as a tool to help us be even more effective in our human relationships. And while we didn't discover the digital divide during the pandemic, its effects on learning and mental health were made more obvious. The inequality among our students became more visible. But we need to be innovative in our thinking about how we use technology to help close the divide rather than widening it, and make public health education available to anyone, anytime. This may include our degree-seeking students, but also how do we bring people from the general population into better understanding public health? COVID-19 definitely increased people's awareness of public health, but I'm afraid this awareness may not represent what public health really is. And there's no one size fits all in education. Online education isn't perfect. It's not preferred for all students. And I think we should continue to be flexible. Faculty, staff, and students have grown during the pandemic. Educators and students should be proud of the way they adapted and responded to the challenge the pandemic presented. Educators found webinars and online resources on their own and through their schools and universities to prepare for the new realities of teaching. As a result of these new opportunities, we learned that professional development could be successful using a learn-as-we-go approach. Now I want to share 4 best practices that I believe have emerged, and I hope will continue as we walk into our new reality. In 2018, nearly 35% of students enrolled in higher education were enrolled in online courses. What was once a niche market of virtual and online education has become a popular and ubiquitous learning method. Faculty who were once against online education explored new educational pedagogies and discovered a hidden talent. They were able to reach their students in ways they couldn't imagine. Students who didn't think they could be online learners found they could be online. Online and remote education increased access for students with jobs, for students who are primary caregivers, and for students without or with limited transportation. And Dr. Crookwood also presented additional ways for us to be flexible to build on more of that flexibility, as I hope we do continue to be flexible and offer options for students to learn through face-to-face, online, remote, or hybrid models. I'm going to let you read this quote by Ram Dass. The pandemic offered an opportunity for faculty and staff to understand their students and colleagues better than they had in the past. Before, we were not aware of the lives our students and colleagues were living outside of their roles in the academy. And now today, we've become much more aware. As external challenges become more visible, we became more aware of the human side of education. As Ram Dass encouraged, we started to see and appreciate each person as their own tree. And I think we should continue to use these passionate teaching and learning strategies. I know my students were appreciative of these strategies that provided them with some flexibility, and I feel comfortable knowing that students were still achieving the learning goals and expected outcomes of the course. Those instructors who had already been teaching online had an advantage when education flipped to remote learning. And then there were other instructors who didn't know how they were going to engage their students on Zoom. But many instructors found that certain active learning practices made a difference and could be used on Zoom. Activities that promoted peer interaction through think, pair, share activities, small group activities in breakout rooms, pre-assigned small groups encouraged to work together outside of class, or collaborative exams. Remote learning provided a decided advantage from students' perspectives when it comes to sharing opinions and welcoming diverse views in class, as well as being able to rewatch recordings of Zoom classes. The back channel communication tools, such as chat, provided students with an outlet to engage in classroom discussions. And I think, and I hope we find ways to use these back channel communication tools in our face-to-face teaching, as well as provide supplemental recordings of class information for students to reference if they so desire for their own learning. As we transition to remote learning, instructors were presented with a unique opportunity to make learning more manageable. They needed to reimagine their assessment strategies, providing students with different ways of representing their knowledge and helping students develop expertise in this subject. This included decreasing the dependence on high stakes assessments and instead using multiple assessments and other creative alternatives, such as student created exams. I personally use strategies to reduce the cognitive load for students without diminishing academic rigor. I provided information upfront on expectations, as well as checklists and schedules to allow students to focus on learning rather than expending extra energy on figuring out when assignments are due and what's expected. We developed Canvas course templates so students knew where information was found in their templates and in their Canvas course shells, and they didn't have to hunt from this course to that course. I want to end with this quote by Maya Angelou. She said, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." And I believe we can continue to learn what's better by understanding and embracing innovation. So again, thank you for your time today. And here's my email if anyone has any questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liang. That was great. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Karen Opasich. She's the Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Public Health and Clinical Associate Professor of Health Policy and Administration in the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She has extensive experience in curriculum development, evaluation, and professional accreditation. The challenges and opportunities inherent in the changing educational landscape are of particular interest and part of her everyday lived experience. Today, she will speak on transformative power of intentional learning communities. Karen.
Thank you so much. To this slide. First, I'd like to thank Dean Galea and Dr. Sullivan for the invitation. And I thank my colleagues presenting today because I have been sitting here resonating with each and every one of you. And I'm very happy to be last because you have already discussed many of the things that I'm going to talk about as well. We have talked about the transformative power of our practices and our strategies. And the strategy that I'm going to focus on are intentional learning communities. You'll note that a few people that I mention have already been mentioned by my colleagues. And first of all, I ask, what is transformative learning and how are we transformed by education? And I think all of us would like to think that we, the faculty, are very important in transforming students. But I've come to believe that students are transformed as much by each other, if not more, than by us. So again, according to Mesereau, chances to learn new perspectives really require psychological, convictional, and behavioral change. So our cognitive understandings, our values, and what we do, our actions. So again, both Mesereau and Freire would agree that transformational learning entails critical reflection, discourse, and relationships. This happens on a macro level, of course, but you'll note that this illustration that I have on this slide are dendrites. So we also know neurodevelopmentally that all unique experiences and all new learning creates changes at the neuronal level. So I think we need to pay very close attention to that. So I'd like to remind us all of CUE's high impact practices in education. We've all heard about these and the term these days, the preferred term, tends to be promising practices, but there are 11 of these and more emerging. And I'm focusing on learning communities. So the learning communities involve the integration of learning across disciplines and involve students with big questions. We've already talked some about that, and matter beyond the classroom, that we want them to be thinking and creating and innovating and analyzing on a larger level. When I speak of the learning community, I mean both students and faculty and the external communities in which they engage. Another definition of the learning community is the purposeful restructuring of the curriculum by linking or clustering courses that enroll a common cohort of students. And I'm also going to be focusing on the cohort model of education. So this is very intentional. And later on in my few minutes here, I'll be talking about student responses to the learning community. And one of them very poignantly reminded me that everything that we do, that we design, that we include, and that we conduct in a curriculum ought to be intentional. Lenning's more modern description of the intent of learning communities is that there be optimally effective and ongoing interplay and collaboration among the community's members as they work toward common learning goals. And of course, we have them all in classes, but we have them for curricula as well. And one of my colleagues talked about the overarching purpose and goals of our curricula. So the result there is deep learning, a term that I very much have embraced, that we are not just talking about the transfer of knowledge, but we are talking about the ability to reorganize, analyze, change perspectives, innovate, and strategize. And that requires more than the ingestion of content. This last line will also be expressed by students as I proceed here. The members of the group express mutual trust and loyalty, share ideas, and support one another. That is very hard to achieve if students are taking courses randomly or outside of a sequence or with different groups of students all the time. So again, I go back to Mesereau's 10 phases of transformative learning. Remember that disorienting problem, that vexing problem, and self-examination and all those. But I have highlighted and bolded here the 3 steps in Mesereau's transformative learning formula here that really resonate with intentional learning communities. Exploration of options for new roles, relationships, and actions. Provisional trying of new roles in a protected environment. Building of competence and self-confidence in those new roles and relationships. So before going any further, I'm going to share just very briefly the context in which we conduct learning in very intentional learning communities. So by describing UIC, and this might be a different or a similar environment to any of you. So we have about 33,000 students on our campus, 80% of whom are commuter students. A good proportion of our students are first generation to higher education. In public health, in our public health undergraduate programs, it tends to be about half of them. Many of them learned English as a second, third, or fourth language. Our classes are very diverse. Our campus is among the 9 most diverse campuses of its nature, a Research One institution, and for its size as well, in the country. So we have diversity every which way you can slice it, not just by the NIH categories. And I like to say, when I look out at our students, it's like looking at the League of Nations. Our pre-majors are the first and second year students, the students you might call freshmen and sophomores. And they meet during a first year seminar in which we address values and value systems and academic skills, and we work on engagement because it's all about social engagement. That's what keeps students in their programs. They also take 3 gen ed courses that are public health in nature and that accrue to the prerequisites that help them to transition to the upper division major. Our students matriculate into the full upper division major in the fall of the junior year, and that's when we cohort them. That's when the intentional learning committee becomes so very important. So before classes begin for those juniors, they attend a full day of orientation. They are introduced to each other. They are introduced to the curriculum and the curricular expectations, and they begin to engage and hopefully to develop some level of comfort with their peers. The students take 12 core courses together, and they also take a 0 credit junior seminar over 2 semesters, and in that they deal with non-academic kinds of things. Our public health majors also pursue 25 hours of selectives and electives all across the campus, and we encourage them to do that. They're always identifying new courses that are relevant for public health. And if they're going to medical profession, they might focus on STEM related courses. If they're focusing on our BA, they're looking at social and behavioral sciences and the humanities. The junior seminar meets intermittently through the fall and spring semesters, and we deal with topics such as networking and job searching and applying to graduate school. We also have occasionally School of Public Health visiting scholars presenting in that seminar. All of our courses, each and every one of them, entails group work, and up to 25% of the assignments are group assignments combined with individual work. And we did that based on the literature of how much is enough and what the proportion of group to individual work is desirable. Across our curriculum, groups may be self-selected or purposefully assigned by the instructors, or randomly assigned. So students have an opportunity to work with all the different members of their cohort. Most of our students graduate on time, and that means within a 4-year framework. Only a few need another semester or two to complete requirements. And I am very pleased to say that our 6-year graduation rate at this moment in time is 95%, a figure that I find astounding. So there are challenges. I certainly wouldn't deny that there are challenges in an intentional learning community in which students are together for 12 of their core courses. But there are occasional student conflicts that require intervention or advisement. Group dynamics differ from year to year, and sometimes we have fractured or divided cohorts, and we have to find ways to manage that. There is a tendency for students in those back channels to rely on each other for information rather than clarify with faculty. And so we remind them that to go to the source for clarification, and their questions are probably questions that other students can benefit from as well. Occasionally, there are unaccountable group members that affect the work of the whole or the work of small groups, and we deal with that as well. Sometimes faculty have some trepidation about intentional learning communities at this level because students can band together to dislike one particular professor or one particular class of one kind of content. And we have managed a few situations like that as well. There tends to be in group work a bit of over-reliance on the stronger students to take initiative, but our students have tended to manage those situations all on their own. There's always a question of dosage. How much of any strategy or any best practice or any promising practice is enough to be effective? And is more necessarily better? So we ask those questions even of the intentional learning community. Intentional learning communities might be structurally challenging to schedule because we do schedule them so that students go through the same sequences and they're in the same courses together in the junior and senior years. And intentional learning communities may not be compatible with mega programs where there are hundreds and hundreds of students at each level of instruction. So sometimes that can be achieved through multiple cohorts, but it might be a little trickier to consider an intentional learning community strategy nevertheless. So I wanted to share with you that of CUE's high impact practices in education, we routinely use 9 of the 11 of these, routinely. And even some students will do e-portfolios or pursue internships. But 9 of them we incorporate intentionally, purposefully, and regularly. However, I like to say that the intentional learning community is the strategy that puts all the others on steroids. It tends to magnify the impact of all the other strategies. So we have learned some lessons during COVID as well. And they're probably not too different than lessons that all the rest of you have learned. We know that our students lead very complicated lives. 60% of the students at UIC are Pell eligible, which generally means they're poor. And many of them worked 2 and 3 jobs during the pandemic. Remote teaching and intentionally designed distance education, very different than just remote teaching is one thing, and intentionally designed good online education is quite another, and we're trying to move toward the latter. Issues of equity and inclusion have certainly affected access. We had students who were sharing hardware with siblings. We had students living in multi-generational housing. We had students who had very poor internet connections. We had students who were doing the entire program on their phones, and sometimes those were outdated phones. So we are acutely aware of issues of equity and inclusion just about the distance part of the education. Reaching students in our population is likely then to entail multiple strategies in multiple formats. We also recognize that distance learning isn't for everybody, and that certainly younger and less sophisticated students had some difficulty organizing their own learning and being resilient and persistent in their learning as well. But I'm happy to say that the cohort model really seemed to sustain and support students, particularly our seniors. Credit the cohort for getting them through the pandemic. They're all graduating on time. The juniors, on the other hand, had less reliance on the cohort because they'd never met each other in person. So our seniors had at least one semester where they actually really did know each other and begin to form really solid relationships. So I've shared here some of the comments, just a few selected comments of students about the cohort model and what it did for them, including increase their ability to collaborate, to imbue them with confidence, to help them to develop leadership skills, to develop lasting relationships. And I have to say that most of our cohorts remain networked long past graduation. If I bump into one of them, I learn about 20 others. They also recognize that their problem solving and negotiating and forming and storming is really typical of work that we do in public health. And they appreciate the opportunity to practice that in the cohort model. I have included in my presentation a number of references that you can certainly follow up on. And I call attention to my own article about the cohort model that has lots and lots of references about intentional learning communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Apostich. Thank you. And thank you to all of the speakers. Your words, ideas are so inspirational, and I for one, feel very hopeful about where we're headed. I wonder, I also want to echo, a lot of people are writing in the chat, can I watch this again? You've got so much packed in here. So the recording will be available, so you can watch it again and take your notes, because every single presentation was chock full of so much great information. Our symposium was entitled Transformative Educational Models. And I'm thinking about Dr. Neubauer's definition, or that she shared, about transformative as something forever and radically changed. With that in mind, I wonder if I could ask each of you to tell us one thing that you feel might be most impactful in the area that you discussed for those of us to take away. And anybody can go first.
This is Brenda. I'll chime in just to say, in terms of thinking about our student audience, just get to know our students. I think that's just a key thing that will drive our decisions.
Thank you.
This is Kim. I don't mind chiming in as well. So I would say, so it depends on what level you're talking about, back to my presentation. So if you were to focus on the school level, I would say put substantial, school and university level, put substantial resources towards issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and appoint someone who's a thought leader on this issue. So some schools are now appointing assistant deans of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which doesn't absolve any of us of our responsibilities, but assigns a person as a key thought leader in this area.
Great, thank you.
I would like to reinforce that it's all about relationships, and public health is relational. And so students learn about each other. They learn about their samenesses, their differences, their strengths, their needs, and then they translate that to practice. And we watch them as they pursue those trajectories quite successfully.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think the issue of equitable pipelines is really important. Having students of various identities that are able to talk to other students. So in our program, we have a doctoral student, a group of doctoral students who talk to MPH students, who talk to undergraduate students, who talk to high school students. And so seeing themselves in each other and being able to connect with someone at the other level as a role model has been a really powerful way to incentivize through that interpersonal level as well.
Great, thank you.
And like Karen and Brenda mentioned, I think it's about the compassion and the relationships, just really recognizing that students do have lives outside of school and they have many competing responsibilities, and challenges that they need to address. So making sure that we're flexible in what we're doing, providing options and choices for students.
Thank you.
I'll share one, which is actually an idea. I was chatting with Dr. Stephen Roth last week, which is PLA, prior learning assessment. And if we in academic public health are going to be living in a competency-based world, then I'd really encourage us to learn from many of the sister and kin disciplines that have been doing PLA work for decades, and for us to really consider what can we count, what moves the pathways and pipelines forward, and also to use the both Mesereau and Brookfield idea. It should be difficult. It should be something that we will never go back to. And so that also makes me think of the next 5 years up until the new revision of the CEIF criterion, and wondering what lies ahead for 2026.
Thank you, Leah. That's a really good segue into one of the questions that's come in the Q&A. It was directed to Dr. Kirkwood, but I think it applies to what you're saying. So we'll let Dr. Kirkwood have a go at it first. What do you think are some solutions to encourage faculty and staff with respect to non-traditional students, often extensive experience? As a first-gen student and an alum who was a non-traditional student while in grad school, I often experienced faculty not respecting the expertise I already had.
I appreciate that question, and congratulations, to the individual who posted that as a first-gen student. And so I think it goes back to what we were just commenting about, that the human side of education, getting to know our students. So a few maybe tangible things that educators could do. And probably a lot of educators are doing this, but maybe we need to cultivate it even more so in terms of just at the start of every semester, have everyone in the class introduce themselves, whether it's an online course or in person. And, just to indicate that, everyone does have this varied experience. They have a lot to bring to the table. So they're not just, students aren't there just to absorb material, but they're there to engage, be part of the education, because as others have commented, I too am a believer in students have a lot to learn from one another, not only the instructor. Some other maybe tangible things. One thing that comes to mind is invite those working professionals, those with past experience, invite them to serve on a career panel. They can educate, our other students who may be more fresh out of, undergrad or fresh out of high school. So maybe encourage that type of interaction as well. And I think that may also be just something tangible, that educators could do, but I'll let others chime in for some additional tips.
Thank you. Anyone else like to add to that?
Yes. In our curriculum, and remember that ours is an upper division major, the junior and senior year. Our students, because they get to know each other progressively through all those experiences, they have plenty of opportunities to educate each other, both formally and informally. And through presentations and the selection of topics and working with external communities and even campus communities, they have plenty of opportunities to be the educators. And I've been so impressed with so much of what they've done. And
I'll just mention, I teach a leadership and management course, and there's places in the course where I'm very purposeful about making sure I draw in those experiences from students, because I find that they have a wide range of experiences, from not having a job ever before to people who have supervised and managed, formally supervised and managed hundreds of people, sometimes in the military or corporate. And so there's places where I purposely add in to make sure I am pulling on those experiences.
Great. And there is a question in the Q&A from a public health student asking, how can I help to educate others? So our students are willing to engage. Are there specific things beyond what you've just said that we can direct students to?
I guess don't be shy about sharing your expertise, with others, because everyone is there to learn. So I think that's commendable, when fellow classmates, help each other out. So yes, I'm a believer in, all that interaction, that important interaction, collaboration, knowing that you're all in this together kind of thing, and you all want to learn, because those, I constantly am telling students, network. And so I think that's all part of that too. So yeah, I would say if you are in class and you hear another student talk about a certain organization or that they're interested in, but you have experience with such an organization, meet up with them, or whether it's online or in person, and say, oh, hey, I know you're interested in such and such. So I think that's just one way you can have those informal collaborations, even, outside the classroom too.
Great.
We've taught our students to be ambassadors of public health.
Mm-hmm.
So they participate in associations on campus and off campus where they're representing, interpreting, sharing public health. And certainly during the pandemic, we encourage them to challenge misinformation with empathy, understanding where other people were coming from, but to try to be ambassadors of truth.
Great. Yeah.
No,
go right ahead.
It'll just be quick. And it links the previous question together. I wonder how many of our schools, programs, and units also offer compensated or paid opportunities for students. And we do at Northwestern. We have several opportunities for students to be teaching assistants within my own research team, which is the education research team. And a shout out to some of my students here, Krishi, Yi, Shoshi, and Ezra. It has me thinking about the opportunities we also create that are compensated, that fit the busy student life schedule, where we can actually talk about teaching, and also back to some of the Freire work, really work towards an example of democratizing the learning environment. I think I saw in the chat, someone talked about the co-creation of syllabi as well. Mm-hmm. So those two become other ways we can model ways of doing this. And that's bi-directional for us as well, learning from our student teachers.
Great.
And can I just add one more thing? I think you could also participate in programs that the schools have. So we hold a public health summer experience for high school students. So I know that at Boston, they do something similar, and at some of the other schools here, they may do something as well. And so that's a great opportunity to reach out to high school students and even beyond, reaching out to your high school that you went to your elementary school, and just talking about what public health is. I'm sure if you think about when you learned about public health, it wasn't in high school. And I know today there's, obviously changes with public health awareness, but I didn't learn about public health until I was looking for graduate schools, and I came across this thing. And I think a lot of people have sort of that sort of circuitous story of how they found public health. So it's a great opportunity to just go talk to sort of the pipeline of making sure that people know more about public health.
Great point. There are a couple of questions on a similar topic here, and some of you addressed this in your presentations, and it's the balance between flexibility and rigor. And at what point have we become flexible enough?
We addressed this topic in a faculty meeting recently, and I'm sure every one of us would have a different response to this. I would say this year all bets were off. And we probably erred on the side of flexibility and humanity and compassion to the extreme. We learned some things about that. I don't think we need to toss it all. And our faculty are, each one of them within their own comfort level, is exploring what's really important. What are they trying to convey? What opportunities are absolutely essential? What's icing?
Yeah, I agree. We don't want to throw the baby out after all that we've done and come so far, because I agree with you. Some things are really good and should stay, and it's just a matter of balancing these things. And all of you said it when you talked about flexibility. It wasn't at the expense of rigor. It was in addition to. We're still holding that same line. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. You know, it is a balance. You know, there are maybe some logistical things that one can do to encourage flexibility. You know, for just throwing out one example, and this may vary certainly depending on what the policies are at your own institutions, but we tend to have individuals who they wait until the last minute to enroll in courses. And so, and again, I worked primarily with working professionals. So sometimes they just don't know their schedule until right at the very start of the semester. So one thing that I've been encouraging our own faculty is to build in that time in the beginning of the semester that you know that you may be getting some late ads. So even just something simple like that can actually really make or break success for a student in the course. So they're not starting off, already have missed one, you know, the first exam, etc. So little things like that you can embed throughout.
Yeah, great. Anyone else want to comment on that? Jonathan?
Sure. I think there's also a false dichotomy between rigorous and inclusive that needs to be broken up, especially with the use of GREs or other standardized testing. You know, I've heard narrative about how they're rigorous and they offer rigorous admissions, but in fact, they're just perpetuating racism. And so we need to break up that false dichotomy as well.
Thank you for that. Yes.
And I'll just add, it can be simple as just providing a choice. You know, there's one assignment that we do where students can choose between doing an op-ed, doing a letter to their congressional representative, or an infographic. So we're, you know, assessing the same competency just in different ways, and that those students get a choice of what they want to do and how they want to showcase their knowledge. And they appreciate just having that with a simple choice to be able to select what is best for them and most interesting to them.
And Lisa, this is Kim. I mean, you alluded to this a bit, but I just want to drive home the point that they really are not necessarily antithetical. And the reality is that we have some faculty that are just inherently more flexible in how they teach. And the pandemic, you know, they were able to, they were even more flexible, and then others just less so, because there's this underlying assumption that being flexible undermines the rigor. So I just want to push back on the dichotomy a bit more and argue that they don't have to be considered antithetical.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Leah?
It also has me thinking about that comment from a student that says, I didn't even know that there was flexibility. And I think when I think about that as an educator, you know, it forces me to continue to examine all the unwritten rules and assumptions. But in action for this question, I would think, how am I creating an environment that students understand the requirements, but they also feel safe, right? They feel safe to ask questions or let me know that the course requirements are bumping in to adult life and realities. So it also has me thinking, right, the primary prevention end. What can we do in our environments to help really promote that flexibility is also just an option?
Yeah, it's a very good point. At our last Teaching Public Health symposium, it was on inclusive excellence. And one of the presenters talked about equitable access. And I think that's the point you're making, Leah, is do all students know how to navigate the system? Do they know where to go to ask these kinds of questions? They may not even avail themselves of flexibility that is there. So we've got to be really careful about that. Maybe one last question for Dr. Garcia. It's been sitting there and I want to make sure I ask it. Our questioner is asking, I'm wondering if you have some suggestions or an example for getting diverse students interested in participating in voluntary elective global health programs. I find that these seem to attract a group of students that are not as diverse as my entire student body.
That's an amazing question. And I'll draw on that word that Dr. Opasic used, intentionality. So with the project that I described, there was intentionality in the funding from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to provide an opportunity for identification among Latinx and LGBTQ youth. And so you're intentionally drawing on those mutual identifications about social isolation to build a community and solidarity. And so that's one. And then there are examples of scholarships. So on the structural level, as Dr. Arreola mentioned, scholarships like the Gilman Scholarship have been really useful for students going on education abroad experiences to increase the availability for Pell eligible students. And so those are just two examples. And then the third, I would just draw back to that pipeline approach and getting students interested and letting them know that these opportunities exist through students that they identify with.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I have to draw this to a close. I'm afraid we could keep talking for quite some time about all these topics. Thank you to all of you for your generosity, your inspirational words. It has been really a great, great session. So thank you all so much. It's now my pleasure to turn it back over to Dean Galea, and I want to thank him, as always, for his constant support of education. Dean Galea.
Thank you, Dean Sullivan. First of all, I will echo Dean Sullivan's thank you to everybody. Really, I've been listening and learning from all of you. And perhaps the one thing that jumped out at me most today, which I wonder how many of you actually noticed the same thing. I felt like this was a beginning conversation, and the beginning conversation about what is it that we've learned from the pandemic that we will keep, and what is it that we do not want to keep, and the things that we keep, how do we make them better? I've been sitting here listening, and I'm thinking like, wow, this is a sign of a good conversation, because I have now more questions than where I started with, and I must admit, maybe I'm the only one, but I suspect many of you felt the same way. I haven't been in many conversations yet that are sort of feel like post-pandemic, that are beginning to ask these questions. So I just thought that was really interesting. It was really interesting to hear all of you starting to extract these lessons. These are things that we've learned, and now as we move forward, what do we take forward from this and what do we not? So I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for starting that conversation, and I am very much looking forward to continuing it and continuing to learn from all of you. What a real privilege it was to hear from all of you and to learn from all the presenters, from Dean Sullivan, who's chairing, and from all the people who asked questions and spent time with us today. I want to say thank you again. Thank you for your time, and thank you for all you are doing for public health. It is the longest day of the year. It is the first day of summer. So it felt a little bit like propitious that we actually have this conversation about the future of public health teaching today, as we embark, hopefully, on a summer of hope, emerging from a really, really difficult year and a half that we've lived through as a field, and I think with optimism for what the future holds. To all of you, thank you again. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for being with us today. Everybody, have a wonderful evening.